Hey students, in this video we're going to talk about the United States in the Second World War, and we're going to take a look at the actions taken by the United States at home and abroad. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR would request Congress to formally declare war on Japan, and would be quickly approved. Americans were more fearful than ever. The war had been a distant whisper and nothing more than words in a newspaper, but now the devastation was at home. Americans would become increasingly suspicious of those who were German, Italian, and especially Japanese descent or an immigrant. The American people were not the only ones fearful of who they say was potential foreign agents, but high government officials as well. FDR would place into action Executive Order 9066 that would allow the government officials to round up those who were seen as aliens of enemy nations. German and Italians were placed into concentration camps, but the Japanese were the primary target for this order. Over 100,000 Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans were forced into concentration camps. Roughly two-thirds of these people were American citizens whose rights were being blatantly violated. This action would be challenged to the Supreme Court, but would be found constitutional with Korematsu v. United States. It would not be until 1988 that the United States government would formally apologize and approve reparations of $20,000 to each camp survivor. The government would not only break the bounds of the Constitution on civil liberties, but also cross into the American economy. The economy was still recovering to its fullest potential, but it was not enough to meet the war effort. The War Production Board would be established to dictate to factories and various industries on what to produce and how much to produce. Vehicle manufacturers would be instructed to stop production of civilian automobiles and produce war goods. The war had created a shortage for certain raw materials such as rubber, and the War Production Board would create programs to preserve the usage of rubber by placing into effect speed limits and gasoline rationing. The conversion of factories making civilian goods created a shortage of goods and increased inflation on the American people. The sharp increase of inflation would lead to the creation of the Office of Price Administration that would ration the consumption of critical goods such as meat and butter. The National War Labor Board would also impose wage ceilings to halt increasing wages. The War Production Board would lead to the creation of 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 76,000 ships, and 86,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. The war created a great step forward for social change in the United States. With millions of men leaving for the war effort, women would be welcomed to fill the gap. The war also allowed women to help with the war abroad in non-combat roles, primarily in nursing. The Women's Army Corps, Women's Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, and SPARS gave women several outlets to be able to serve in the war effort. At home, more than 6 million women would enter the workforce in roles that were traditionally for men. Women would go into industrial factories putting together the war machines that the men would use to win the war. But this would not be a permanent step forward. When the war was over, millions of women would return to the home, either by force of employers or voluntarily leave to be homemakers. The return of men from the war and women to the home would create an increase in population, and with it, the baby boomer generation. The war effort would not only help with women in society, but also the advancement of African Americans. Despite the South receiving billions of dollars in federal contracts for the war, African Americans would leave the South for the North and the West. This would cause what was a regional problem of racism to become a national issue. African Americans would face problems finding employment, housing, segregated facilities, and segregation in the armed forces. FDR would take action after A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened to march on Washington. The president would sign an executive order forbidding discrimination in the defense industry and would establish the Fair Employment Practice Commission that would monitor compliance with the executive order. African Americans would rally behind the slogan of the Double V for victory over the dictators abroad and over racism at home. During this time, membership of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, would rise from 50,000 to 450,000. African Americans in the armed forces would not see very much combat and would be limited to construction, longshoremen, and mess hall service. But there was some that did such as the famous Tuskegee Airmen, who flew more than 1,600 air missions and would never lose a single bomber to the enemy. The Japanese Imperial Army was an efficient lightning strike of a war machine. The territorial expansion of Japan was astonishing. The Japanese was moving southward in the Pacific in 1942, threatening Australia. American and Australian naval forces would stop the Japanese advancement at the Battle of Coral Sea with a carrier task force. The fighting was done with aircraft carriers, and not a single shot was made from ship to ship. And a larger threat was Japan's desire to seize the island of Midway. This was of extreme strategic importance in the Pacific. If Japan overtook the island, it could launch waves of attacks on Hawaii and compel the United States to a ceasefire in the Pacific. On June 3rd to the 6th of 1942, the United States, under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, would fight off the Japanese juggernaut. After taking out 4 vitally important Japanese carriers, the Battle of Midway would be a pivotal victory to stop the advancement of the empire and beat them back to mainland Japan. The Battle of Midway opened up the United States to be able to advance into the Japanese islands. This strategy would be a series of island hopping towards Tokyo. The United States Navy and Army General Douglas MacArthur would slowly capture strategic islands that were not heavily fortified and would cut off supplies to Japanese positions that would starve out those imperialist soldiers and create airfields to lay waste to Japanese bases through heavy bombing. The United States developed new technology with Hellcat fighter planes and B-29 bombers that would be able to fly round-trip bombings, allowing the United States to beat back the Japanese. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, the Allies were facing a familiar and annoying foe of German U-boats, but the Allies were quickly gaining the upper hand. The Allies used the old tactic of dropping depth charges to escort convoys of merchant vessels, increasing of air patrols with newly invented radar, which would reveal the elusive German wolf packs, and bombing submarine bases. A huge leap forward for the Allies was the cracking of the German Enigma code by British national Alan Turing. This code would allow the Allies to intercept and decode messages revealing the location of German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic would not have been won without the international effort of the United States and Britain. This victory could not come sooner, as the Nazis were developing Walter-type U-boats that would remain underwater indefinitely. By 1942, the Soviets had suffered millions of soldiers and civilians dying at the hands of the Nazis. Stalin was asking the other Allied powers to start a Western front to get the Germans out of the Soviet Union. The British were very wary about a Western front in France because of the memories of World War I, but the fear that the Soviets would pull out of the war was a larger threat. The Americans and British would launch an assault in French-held northern Africa as a second front. This was far from what the Soviets wanted to ease the pressure. In November of 1942, under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a joint Allied force of 400,000 men and about 850 ships would invade Tunisia and force the surrender of the German and Italian army in May of 1943. With the victory in northern Africa, the Allies would turn to Italy. In January of 1943, Churchill and FDR would meet to discuss the strategy of invading Italy. The two concluded that upon victory that they would demand unconditional surrender. This would smooth over tensions with Stalin, who was always suspicious of the Western Allies. In August of 1943, the Allied forces would claim victory in Sicily. A mere month later, Italy would surrender and take Mussolini out of power. Despite the unconditional surrender of the Italian force, the German forces would fight furiously for many months. Finally, on June 4th, 1944, Rome was taken. The victories in Italy was not enough for Stalin. He desired a full assault in the west to get the Germans stretched to their brink. This front would come on June 6, 1944. Normandy was selected as an invasion point because it was not as heavily defended as other beachheads. The Allies would exchange false information of an earlier invasion at a more northern point to reduce the defense at Normandy. Nonetheless, the Germans would not allow the beachhead to be taken so easily. On June 6, 1944, the largest naval armada would be assembled with over 4,000 vessels would descend onto the beaches of Normandy. There, the Germans would fiercely fight from their bunkers with machine guns, turning the shores red with the Allied men's blood. By June 11th, the beaches were taken from the Germans at great cost. From Normandy, the Allied forces would launch across France. The divisions under the command of legendary American General George S. Patton would thunder through the French woodlands and hasten the advancement of the Allied forces. The Allied effort would retake Paris in August of 1944. The days of Hitler's 1,000 years of the Fourth Reich were quickly coming to an end. The Nazis were being squeezed out by the Western powers in the West and the Russian Bear in the East. The Nazi war machine was grinding to a halt and was being dismantled. When the Allied forces reached the western borders of Germany, Hitler would concentrate his forces and attack on December 16, 1944, in what would be called the Battle of the Bulge. American commander Brigadier General McAuliffe would be caught by surprise and surrounded. Upon receiving a message from the German commander to surrender, McAuliffe, who was known not to curse, would send back a message stating, "Nuts," the American commander. Confused by this message, the Germans would delay any attack, buying time for General Patton and Eisenhower to liberate the American forces. The American troops would cross the Rhine River and advance deep into Germany. There they would meet with Russian forces and begin their offense on Berlin. When the American troops were crossing the German land, they would find in horror the concentration camps that Hitler had placed European Jews in. Americans would liberate those in the death camps and had to slowly rehabilitate survivors back to health. It was at these camps that the world would learn the terrible torment of millions of Jews. By the end of the war, over 6 million Jews would be, in Hitler's terms, exterminated simply for their ethnicity and faith. On April of 1945, the Soviets would reach Berlin and take over the city with bloodlust. Underground in his bunker, Hitler would wed his mistress Eva Braun, and both would commit suicide. Finally, the terrible tyranny of Hitler's Nazi Germany had come to an end. On May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany would officially surrender unconditionally. May 8th is now known as VE Day to celebrate the end of the Nazi regime. Hitler was now dead and the Nazi scourge finished. But in the Pacific, the empire of the rising sun was beginning to set. The mighty United States Navy was extremely successful with the island-hopping campaign. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels quickly, sinking over half of the supplying fleet for Japanese forces. The Japanese soldiers would fight to the bitter end at every position, taking heavy tolls on the American forces. After 25 days of fighting, Americans would take the much-needed island of Iwo Jima and go on to take Okinawa, suffering over 50,000 casualties. The fighting spirit of the Japanese could no longer be ignored. The question that was posed to American strategists was, how do we end an enemy that does not fear death? The answer would come in the form of the most devastating weapon created and used, the atom bomb. During the war, the United States had conducted a secret experiment to create a weapon that would force an enemy to surrender or die. This was known as the Manhattan Project. This project was headed by some of the most brilliant minds of the time, some of which were refugees of war-torn Europe. This project started after Albert Einstein discovered that the Germans were developing an atomic weapon. Luckily, the Germans had abandoned their nuclear ambitions due to the cost. The United States was on the path for victory, but FDR did not live to see the day. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt would suffer a massive cerebral hemorrhage and die. His vice president, Harry Truman, would have to take the helm of commander-in-chief. Truman would meet with Stalin and British leaders of the Potsdam Conference, and they would offer Japan an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. Japan would refuse. On August 6, 1945, a lone American B-29 bomber by the name of Enola Gay would carry a devastating weapon nicknamed Little Boy and drop it on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 30% of the city's population would instantly be killed from the explosion. Over 70,000 would be injured from the blast. 2 days later, the Soviets would attack Japanese positions in China and Korea. The Japanese still refused to surrender. On August 9th, the B-29 bomber, the Boxcar, would drop a second atom bomb nicknamed Fat Man on Nagasaki. Over 70,000 Japanese would instantly die, with thousands more suffering from the explosion. Facing obliteration, the Japanese would send word of surrender on August 10th, 1945. Japan would officially surrender on September 2nd, 1945. Americans at home would fanatically celebrate in the streets on what would be known as VJ Day. Finally, under the mushroom cloud of the atom bomb, the war was over. The war would take a terrible toll on humanity, with over 70 million people dying. World War II killed more civilians than it did military combatants. The United States was extremely blessed to be largely untouched from the war, but Europe, Russia, and Eastern Asia had been heavily bombed and had a hard road to recovery. The world was forever changed. Well, students, that's the end of Chapter 35. Please make sure that you guys are reading your book, wash your hands, do not touch your face, and stay indoors.